Hey everybody, welcome to the Did You Know Crypto podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. Today's show is going to be a little bit different than what I usually do, and it's going to be a guest who's different than someone I usually talk to. Most of the circles that I run in are mostly libertarian. A lot of, but not all of, Bitcoin is kind of a libertarian leaning-ish group of people. So I've been going out of my way to try and expand my circle a bit and get different people's perspectives on Bitcoin and why it's important to them. And talking to somebody who's about as left of myself as I've really interacted with, I thought was a really good thing to do. It was a great conversation. Of course, we don't agree on everything, but there are aspects of what we agree on. And I think it's a really interesting thing, and I think it's important for everybody out there who may go, I don't really want to hear what a socialist has to say. I think it's important, even if you go like they're going to say things that are absolutely ridiculous. It's important to know what the other side's saying if you want to be able to, talk to them, if you want to be able to try to convince them of a better way, or if you want to try to refute their own arguments with them or with a different crowd. So I think you should go into this with an open mind and just kind of, it's just two people who are passionate about Bitcoin talking about Bitcoin and what led them to that decision. I know I'm going a little bit long here again in the intro, but if you could go over to iTunes, leave me a 5-star review, I'd really appreciate it. And also, I'm going to be releasing a discounts program for listeners and supporters, absolutely free. Go to supportmypodcast.com/discounts. That's supportmypodcast.com/discounts, and you're going to have discounts on things from Keep Keys to Tracers to Bitcoin art and Bitcoin merchandise and clothing, as well as a lot of health food stuff that I like to use, keto-related stuff, mushroom coffee, which, Google that from Four Sigmatic. It's a pretty cool stuff. I really like it. And also, topically right now, if you could go over to Bitcoin FORALS, bitcoinforals.com, and help support a really cool thing that is being run right now, which is to support ALS research and Hal Finney's name. If you don't know who Hal Finney is, Google it. He's a very important person, probably the second most important person in Bitcoin's history, in my opinion. You can also go on Twitter at Bitcoin4ALS. That's the number 4, Bitcoin, the number 4 ALS. Follow it, and we're going to be supporting them in their efforts to honor Hal's memory. So, sorry again for going long, but I want to say thank you for listening and enjoy the show. I'd like to welcome Ben, better known as BTC Socialist on Twitter. As well as twittering, Ben also has produced a collection of tutorials on the World Crypto Network on YouTube using cheap hardware to make everyday devices. Ben, welcome to the show.
Hello, how do you do?
Good. I was glad that we were able to do this, and we kind of talked a little bit through DMs and everything like that, but the reason that I wanted to do this was that I mostly run in kind of libertarian circles, since kind of the majority of Bitcoin falls somewhere kind of on that spectrum, no pun intended. Perhaps less so today than it did, 3 to 4 years ago. It's a little bit different than it was when I first kind of started jumping in 2013, 2014. But I think the reason, one of the big things is that this kind of falls along the lines of what I view as one of the more important aspects of the kind of pseudo-anonymous Satoshi meme, is that he created a framework in which different people of different backgrounds can kind of attach their own meaning to it and attach their own meanings to Bitcoin and what it represents to them. And that way kind of doesn't necessarily peg Bitcoin to any one thing or belief or anything like that. And that allows that network to enlarge. So I think before we actually kind of get into anything kind of more deeper or detailed, I think we need to kind of define two things. And first, why don't we start with, what is your explanation of Bitcoin? What is Bitcoin to you?
Well, my explanation of Bitcoin would be, it's as if we've kind of discovered gold for the first time, and it's these big lumps of this attractive looking metal which we're finding on the ground, and we're like, well, this stuff looks good, and then we're using it, we're excited about it, and we're using it, we're passing it between each other, and we're using it to kind of exchange value. But we have absolutely no idea of the sort of commodity value in the future, which will be found from these lumps of gold. So it has, the values which we can use it for value transfer, but like as with gold, gold's used in dentistry, it's used in computers. It's I think there's more gold in a ton of old mobile phones than there is a ton of gold ore now. So it has all these additional uses which those original people who first saw those lumps of attractive gold wouldn't have been able to think of. And for me, that's that's pretty much Bitcoin. Bitcoin's at a kind of an early stage. We've invented this thing, we've made this thing, and we just don't really know what to do with it. So we're just sort of passing it like dumbly to each other. You say that Bitcoin has been predominantly sort of libertarian or since you've been involved in it since 2013, but pre then, in the very early days, there was quite a bit more discussion from different political camps around Bitcoin, and I feel that some of the sort of left side kind of got drowned out somewhat, and I've noticed that when because obviously I'm quite outward with my ideology. With my Twitter name, and when I go to conferences and meetups, people are kind of they're either intrigued or they come along and secretly say to me, "Yeah, there's a lot of things I agree with, which you say." So that's partly why I decided to kind of raise the flag and come out a bit more and say, I as a socialist, I can see socialist values which are inherently in Bitcoin, in my opinion. But as also you said, which is a very important point, is Bitcoin, at the end of the day, it's a protocol, and you can apply politics to something like email. You could say it's, I don't know, email's anarcho-capitalist in some way or whatever, or socialist in another way. But it's really just a protocol which enables you to do a thing or a bunch of things. So I think I'm always overwhelmed by how Satoshi remained unpolitical. There's that one Cal Finney quote, I think, where Hal Finney says something about people running their own nodes, which he says just to support the network, and then Satoshi says, "Yeah, I think it would appeal to the libertarian mindset or something." So I think that's as political as Satoshi got. So yeah, I mean, it's currently it feels very sort of libertarian, and when I say libertarian as well, I say it with a pinch of salt, because for me, libertarianism and for many people in Europe is different to kind of the US version of libertarianism. So historically, libertarianism challenged the idea of private ownership over the means of production. But then, sort of during the time of Ayn Rand, libertarianism and Rothbard, it took on a new meaning in the States. And this is, you can verify all this. Go on Wikipedia. I think it's like the second paragraph under libertarianism. The term became co-opted. So within socialism, there's a tradition of libertarian socialists, which goes right back all the way back to Charles Dickens was a libertarian socialist and wrote about the sort of inequalities in London at the time and so on. With a lot of these sorts of things, it's very hard to talk about them without making definitions or making clear definitions, so you know exactly what you're talking about. So yeah, at the beginning of the show, I did warn you that I have a tendency to ramble on. So
No problem. No, I think that when I ask that question, what is Bitcoin? I view that as more subjective, and I think that it's a really good question, less so as some sort of attempt to define the objective.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, no, sure. That was, I suppose, that was my,
yeah.
That was probably my I kind of wrapped up what you said about the sort of libertarian aspect of Bitcoin. But no, as what Bitcoin is to me, I mean, for me, it's the people's money. It's the money version. The us passing these lumps of scarce material to each other. It's the people's money, owned and regulated by the people. I think it's in its infancy, and I think there's a whole load of commodity uses which we'll probably find in the future. But also, I think a couple of its most important properties, which well, people do discuss, is it's free and open source software, and that's very important. But it's it feels like non-proprietary software. So when Linux was battling Microsoft in the 90s. And it was battling the proprietary software. It was just like a small guppy. It was insignificant in comparison to the scale and the amount of value and energy and effort which was going into Microsoft. But just the idea alone of groups of these hackers just building this software from their bedrooms or whatever, or from very modest backgrounds, was terrifying to the big corporates. And now it's Linux's and free and open source software is a kind of cornerstone of our digital world. And I think Microsoft now is one of the biggest open source contributor, because they've had to adapt. So the non-proprietary software has forced the proprietary software to kind of contribute more and behave itself, because it's no longer kind of got that monopoly. If Microsoft and if the Apple or whoever, the software companies, if they treat their customers too poorly, then their customers have this open source option which they can download for free, and it's safe and it works. Sometimes a little bit more clumsy than the proprietary software, but that's getting better over time. So for me, Bitcoin kind of feels like that. It's this opt-out option. So you have your proprietary fiat currency, and then you have this opt-out. You have Bitcoin, and if the fiat, if it isn't working properly, and if they don't behave themselves, then you have that option to opt out into Bitcoin. So I think that's a very important value, in that it will encourage, in the future, it will encourage fiat to behave itself more and more. And just as kind of Microsoft reacted to free open source, it had to kind of get involved and start engaging in it. And I imagine fiat will probably do the similar thing with regard to Bitcoin. And the other property which people don't talk about as well is this apolitical nature. So if you look at the past, well, post World War II, how much of the conflicts in the world have boiled down to the US trying to keep the dollar as the world reserve currency, and it's almost too much of a burden for a country to have its currency as the world reserve currency, that which people buy and sell things like oil in, for example. So to have like an apolitical money, a backbone for the world economy, it's create in my opinion, much more stable world where there's a lot less conflict, because there won't be this big, currency which has to fight to keep its place. So it's interesting as well, because this is the problem with sort of defining Bitcoin as belonging to one political group or one particular set of economists, like the Austrians, or John Maynard Keynes. So when he went to pitch, what's it called, the Bretton Woods Agreement, when he went to the Bretton Woods Agreement, where they decided that the US dollar would be gold-backed dollars would be the world reserve currency, and would be used by all the other countries to trade between countries. John Maynard Keynes, his proposal was to have a decentralized, federated currency called the Bancor, and the Bancor was going to be a collection of commodities which would have a set interest, and then countries would. It's a real complicated but very clever system to try and. So John Maynard Keynes' primary motivation was to create world stability. We kind of forget that the world is a very unstable place. Well, it's clear that it's an unstable place, but post World War II, they were very aware that it was a very unstable place. And John Maynard Keynes, his goal was to just try and make the world more stable and safe. So he came up with this concept of this Bancor, which was this apolitical money, because he knew that the dangers of having a political money, having a country which owns the world reserve currency, and just think what would have happened between the end of the World War II, and now had the Bancor been used as the world's world reserve currency as opposed to the US dollar.
Yeah, just going back just a little bit, I just wanted to say that you did make some absolutely correct points in that there is a difference, and we in America kind of take, in the American libertarianism kind of tend to forget that there is a different definition. And as far as I know, just doing my limited amount of reading on this, was that I believe that by the time that Rand and them basically, because they came, I think that term was pretty much defunct in kind of the in left circles. Like they didn't really use liberal or libertarianism much anymore, and I think that's why they decided to adopt that. It was kind of an out of use term. I'm not 100% on that, but it was definitely a co-opted term that means absolutely two different things. I think that Noam Chomsky would consider himself a libertarian socialist, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, he sort of outwardly calls himself, but he also calls himself an anarchist. And this is, and so anarchism's another term which is kind of somewhat being co-opted. So when you talk to ANCAPs, and like Proudhon, the first self-proclaimed anarchist, he's the one who said that property is theft. So how do you go from that to like anarcho-capitalism? Like it's quite a reach, it's quite a journey. But then it kind of makes so you have then these capitalists or libertarian, Rothbard, Austrian type economists will call themselves like an anarchist. And I'm like, how are you an anarchist? Like for me, anarchism is far left. It's left and a little bit more. So more left than socialism. So it does make it incredibly difficult, like when you're trying to engage in debate and conversation when people just have these completely different definitions,
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, no, and just kind of, I guess, rolling into the second definition that I wanted to kind of get out of the way right at the beginning is for you, when you call yourself a socialist, what do you mean by that? How do you define that term?
Well, I mean, yeah. So that's often what people will ask when I bump into them in meetups or conferences. They'll say, "So, why do you call yourself a socialist?" And I'll say to them, "Well, you define socialism for me," and then they'll often come back with, "Well, it's about government control and state and centralization and things which, as a Bitcoiner, I'm against." And then I'll say, "Well, yeah, I'm against those things too, but I'm still a socialist." So, socialism, if you Google, define socialism, and then just get, the dictionary definition of socialism, and it's the political and economic theory that advocates that the means of production, distribution, and exchange be controlled and regulated by the community, as a whole. So it just means decentralizing control, essentially. So, and this is how in which I can very much relate it to Bitcoin. There's a number of ways to try and achieve that end. One of them is government, which some people, some countries will try, or democracy, and they'll try and achieve this ideal, and they'll have some. For some things, it kind of works okay, like healthcare, universal healthcare. That's the data seems to point towards that the countries with the better healthcare systems are national healthcare systems. Education, I used to be an educator, and it's very important that kids have access to education. Roads, government's pretty good at doing roads, but it's still buggy. It's still not perfect. And as I said, I used to be an educator. I used to work for education, and it was such an inefficient system which wasted a hell of a lot of money. So, so government's a tool to try and achieve that dictionary definition, which is the means of production, distribution, and exchange be owned or regulated by the community as a whole. Bitcoin for me is maybe another technology which could be used to achieve that. And inherently in Bitcoin, it's decentralized, and who owns Bitcoin? The community owns Bitcoin as a whole. Who has ownership over its regulation? The community as a whole. And that's kind of the beautiful thing about Bitcoin, is that you can be a homesteader, with your node running on your satellite. off grid with a, I don't know, solar panel, whatever. But then occasionally you need to decide whether you're going to do a software update. And when you decide whether you're going to do that software update, you're engaging in a community decision on how to take that software forward. And that decision-making process has been taken away from, the centralized decision makers in something like fiat, for example. And it's been given to the people, to the community as a whole. So you can't already talk about socialism without talking. So that's my definition of socialism, is that dictionary definition. But then obviously, you people will say, well, what about all these horrible examples where you've had, like the USSR or, Mao or Pol Pot or however. So Karl Marx he was anti-state. He didn't like state. He thought that state was a structure to enforce sort of class hierarchy, and he didn't like it. He wanted it to wither away and die. And he said it would in socialism. Karl Marx arrived at socialism by looking at slavery, then feudalism, then capitalism, and then just saying that, we're not at the end of history, and these previous systems collapsed in on themselves because they had these contradictions, and capitalism's probably going to do the same, and then hopefully we'll get this thing called socialism. Or the collapse will kind of cause this thing called socialism. But he was always very hazy on how that transition would happen, deliberately, because he didn't know. He knew that it would happen, because basically the worker, the producers would become so oppressed that they'd sort of overthrow, the capitalists. He imagined it would be bloody and horrible, just like the French Revolution, which had happened a few years before he was born. Or 50 years before he was born or something. But I'm more hopeful that revolution, that those oppressed people who kind of rise up and take control over the means of production, I'm more hopeful that happened through, peaceful means, through worker cooperatives, through even things like, in the modern workplace, more and more workers are getting more autonomy, because it's more productive for workers to have autonomy. Just look at like kind of agile and Kanban systems, in IT companies or whatever. The role of the management is to in a good company is to kind of orchestrate the workers so the workers feel like they have some more autonomy. The next step is to kind of get rid of maybe not get rid of the managers. The managers, they often serve a very important role, and you still have managers in co-ops, but to get rid of the capitalists, so the person who actually owns the means of the production, and then have the means of production owned by the people who actually work in an institution. So currently the sorts of socialism we have within democracy, for example, is quite good at healthcare and education, that sort of stuff. It's absolutely miserable and horrendous at industry. And when people have tried to use government to make industry, to socialize industry, it's got quite messy. But it's okay. It's okay at healthcare and education. So I do ramble. Where was I? Yeah, let me backtrack a little bit on myself. The bad rap which socialism gets, the USSR and Mao and Pol Pot, very important point. So post-Marx, Lenin, who was a politician and wanted to take control of the USSR, he brought into being this idea of state capitalism. There was a few thinkers, I can't remember the name of the guy, Lassalle, I think his name is, who came with this idea that in order to get from capitalism to socialism, they would create this thing called state capitalism. So the state would take control of the means of production, and then it would like set up the environment so, the society could control them. You could have worker-owned, factories or whatever. Lo and behold, when Lenin took power, he disbanded the trade unions and then killed a bunch of, socialists and communists, and what they had was state capitalism, wasn't socialism, and that then passed to Stalin, and then Lenin, till his dying day, he said that the USSR was state capitalist. It wasn't. It was a holding system to bring about socialism. And that model was then used again in China and used again in all these other horrible examples of people trying to force socialism. Sadly, as well, the concept of socialism is very easy to sell to poor people. So if you're, a tyrant and a dictator and you want to take control of a country full of poor, hungry people, if you tell them, look, I'm going to give you the control just for now, just give me the right to take control of all these industries, they'll help you get into power. So the way in which Marx envisioned socialism happening, he thought that it would happen in the country with the most evolved capitalist form of capitalism, sort of true capitalism, which at the time he thought was probably going to be Germany, because Germany was the most kind of advanced society, and he thought that would probably then evolve into socialism. But he didn't think it was going to happen anytime soon, and he didn't give an outline as to how it would happen. So when I see something like Bitcoin or free and open source software, why does free and open source software exist? It exists because some people wanted to take control of the software. The producers, the programmers who made the software said, no, we want control of the software. So they went away and they made the Free Software Foundation, and we end up with free and open source software. Why do we have Bitcoin? The centralized government, or I tend to think of government and corporate conglomerates as kind of all being mixed up together. So there's just the rich Mr. Monopolies out there. He's got control of money, and money tends to drift towards him. And then we, the people, have said, no, we don't want that anymore. We want our own money, which we don't have to trust, trusted third parties. We want to have control over our money as a community, or we just want, even just to be self-sovereign, and we don't want you to have control of our money. And then we decentralize it. So that conflict is something Marx talked a lot about, between those in control and the majority who don't have control. And then that revolution is then the thing which he then went on to talk about after his analysis of previous revolutions. So I think it may be in a roundabout way that I might have covered my interpretation.
No, so I guess one of my first questions would be, as far as from your perspective as a Bitcoiner and a socialist, what is currently wrong with the fiat banking system as it exists now, or as it would exist, let's just say, in a socialist system? Why is Bitcoin better for a socialist system than having a socialist system in the means of production, owned at a lower level and not at the state level, or at the corporate level?
Well, so if it's owned at the state level, then that's not socialism. See, I mean, that's very clear. Yeah. Like, you can look at the definition of state capitalism, socialism.
Yeah.
So but that's often the confusion, though. See, this is the real problem, and it's a definition thing again. Unless you define socialism as just being producer control over the means of production, then people often then concatenate sort of state capitalism in there as well. And then when I'm saying, look, I'm a socialist, people are like, oh, you're horrible. You want the state to control everything. It's like, no, I don't want that. that's not socialism. But no, I see your point. Like, how will Bitcoin what in a socialist worldview, how's Bitcoin gonna be better than fiat, for example?
Yeah, because if you had the producer ownership of the means of production, whether I guess without getting into too deep of the definitions, but in the socialist world that meets your definition you'd like to see, what would be the benefit of having Bitcoin versus them just kind of having their own fiat banking system within that socialist system?
Well, I think in the medium term, in the short term, obviously Bitcoin is just going to kind of continue to be volatile. But when it actually starts getting adopted by people properly in the medium term, it will bend the arm of government. We'll still have fiat, but fiat will be it'll have to behave itself more and more, and then it'll start engaging in Bitcoin more, and then eventually it may even become, so I don't know, the British pound, it might be a side chain of Bitcoin, much like the sort of liquid network or something. And it'd be pegged to Bitcoin, and Bitcoin would be kind of it could be used as a settlement layer for countries to, send value to one another, or it could just be used by normal people if they get so annoyed at their fiat system, which isn't working properly. In that sort of scenario, they can still have things like inflation, but they can't have too high inflation, or else people are just going to leave and go to Bitcoin. I suppose it is just a matter of time before Bitcoin then starts swallowing up all the value. But government still has some benefits in centralization, in that it's sort of less cumbersome than Bitcoin, and it can I don't know, and it can if it needs to create more value, it can kind of inflate slowly, I suppose. But so I think a lot of people who are used to working with fiat, they'll continue to kind of use that system for a while. But like you say, eventually we'll all kind of move to Bitcoin. I think John Nash. Do you know John Nash, the mathematician?
I'm familiar with him. I'm not intimately familiar with a lot of his work, though.
Yeah. So in the last few years of his life, for most of his life, he was obsessed by money, and for the last few years, he talked about this thing called ideal money. And in his ideal money scenario, he kind of thought of there would be a natural competitor, which would then force the hand of fiat to force fiat to behave itself, and that's kind of a more ideal form of money. Then like this. So you have the non-proprietary, the proprietary. But I think the non-proprietary eventually will win out overall. When it does, and the ability for the rich 1% to rig the game, so the inflated currency, which is losing value for everyone else, they're pocketing more and more of it because they're in bed with the government. Their ability to have that relationship will become less and less, and which would mean that the people, and then if it goes the way I want it to go, in that Bitcoin can facilitate co-ops, worker co-ops, the technology of Bitcoin can facilitate that, then people will receive more value. They'll receive as opposed to maybe now they receive 60% of the value which they're putting into the system. They'll receive 99%, and then 1% will go to, I don't know, bounties on a bit of software or whatever. So with tax, for example, there's still points of contact which can be taxed. So I'm not against tax. I like the school my kids go to, and the roads which I drive on, and the park we play in and stuff. They're nice. I like the fact my bins get picked up, and I wouldn't want to live in a world where I'm paying private companies to do any of those things. It's something which I think as a society we can get together, and we can work these things. We have since societies first existed. We've made common land, common spaces where we can do things. Taxes will still exist, but there'll be taxes on wages, for example. So people who are paid a lot of money, they pay more tax. The taxes on value-added tax on purchases, real world purchases in a country. So like property, for example, rich people, they like buying big houses. So you can get tax there as well. So I think this is I'm not sure. It's really hard to think about time frames, because you think maybe all this stuff is like 100 years down the road or 50 years down the road, but everything seems to be accelerating so fast.
I agree.
You can't kind of think, well, this in the next 10 years, countries will start to be outcompeted by Bitcoin, and their reaction will be that their forms of fiat will become more accountable, and they'll become better, you know, and people will carry on using their crappy currency for a little bit longer. Because we could have some horrible economic crisis. And this is my other point as well. This is why I think it's very important to address the socialist thing, is when we have a huge economic crisis. I remember the last one in 2008, and I remember listening onto the radio, and I remember people saying, "Oh, you know, is capitalism failed?" You know, and at the time it kind of felt absurd to me, you know, because for me, I thought there was no alternative at that time. So I wasn't much of a socialist really until, I mean, I liked the idea of it, but I thought it was unworkable until I saw Bitcoin. But this time, when the next big economic crisis happened, and I think most of us agree it's going to be probably worse, which is more or less definitely means it will be absolutely horrendous. There'll be a lot of hungry people, very angry, hungry people who will want to just attack and destroy and create new systems. And people will be talking about it again. They'll be saying, well, has capitalism failed, for one? And then they'll be saying, so what is this Bitcoin thing? And maybe we should be putting our trust in that. And then they'll be saying, you know, should we try and create a more socialist environment, or should we try and work on these worker co-op things? Or I don't know. It's quite a terrifying concept, because for me, economic crisis, you know, again, you know, you read Keynes, you know, he predicted the Second World War after the reparations against the Germans in the First World War. Economics heavily influenced conflict. So the concept of a huge world economic crisis is absolutely, and particularly being in Europe as well, is absolutely terrifying. But yeah, it's I don't know how we got to this point from tax, but
yeah, no, but I do agree. I think that economics is so much more important than people realize, because I believe it was a couple episodes ago, I was talking with Jeffrey Tucker, I believe, and I looked over to my right, and I've started to actually collect inflated currencies of the world, you know, like the Zimbabwe notes and bolivars.
Yeah,
and
I've got a few.
And one of them I have is like $100 million Reichsmark note from 1923, I think. And you know, it was, you know, interesting. That kind of fit into with a book I'd been reading recently. It's by Vera Brittain. She was a British peace activist. She was a nurse in World War I. But anyways, what they, you know, what I'm getting at is that I think that you can draw a direct line, and this kind of goes into the idea of non-interventionism as well, of U.S. involvement in World War I, is probably, you can draw a pretty direct line between that and the outcome of World War I, and being able to impose those sorts of reparations on Germany, which, you know, those sorts of outcomes, that's a lot of what-ifism, I get that, but those sorts of outcomes result in a reality that there's no way, or I should say, it's highly unlikely that someone like Adolf Hitler is going to rise to power in a Germany that was struggling because of the war, but wasn't absolutely completely in shambles. That's when a failed painter and a rabble rouser, you know, yelling in bars at the time, gets elevated to that sort of position.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. And Keynes wrote, I mean, so you say, like, you know, it's kind of in retrospect now, but, you know, Keynes wrote a book called The Reparations of the War, and in it he said, we're going to have another world war, and this was after World War One, and this was based entirely on the way in which we treated the Germans. So no, you can predict these things, and so, you know, obviously we've, in the UK here, we've got the sort of Brexit coming up, and sort of harder European borders, and which again for me is quite a scary concept, because Europe's it's a tinderbox. It could explode at any, and it's a powder keg. It could explode at any time. So I think that a lot of us who are, you know, like the little hardware things which I make, you know, a lot of the people who feel this sense of urgency with Bitcoin, like, we need to get this stuff built, we need to get it built now, we need to get it working, we need to get it ready. A lot of it is because we have this fear, this maybe it's just in the back of our minds subconsciously, that we're going to have this horrendous crisis and people will turn to Bitcoin, and our shit needs to be together because we need to be able to provide this solution, you know. which will hopefully then make the world a little bit more stable, with apolitical money, and with yeah. So hopefully we'll make the world a little bit more stable. So yeah. So what was the question again?
Oh no, we originally had started talking about the concept of why would Bitcoin be better than fiat in a world that has moved on to where the means of production are in the producers' hands. But I guess the next thing I wanted to go into is that I guess looking at things in a socialist system, one of the reasons that I became a libertarian and moved from being kind of this interventionist neocon type of person, basically a big fan of George Bush, and the reason I did that was because I came to the moral decision that I don't believe that the initiation of force is ever okay, that defensive use, and that's an individual choice too. If there's some people who choose to completely turn the other cheek, right, and never even use defensive use, but the idea of initiating force, I feel, is never morally acceptable. And to me, the only way to enforce forms of like taxation, or to a lot of times when I'm arguing, and we kind of talked like this offline, but I guess I didn't really kind of preface this with the listeners, is that this was not meant to be so much a although it may just very well devolve into kind of like just a discussion of the topic, but this is not a like a debate on the merits and of socialism versus libertarianism, or just either way. But what I always struggle with when I talk to socialists ever is, so in this system, if I decide like I want to I guess this is using a bad example because this is the concept of renting or whatever, but if I decide to do that, what happens? I mean, it usually ends up being whoever enforces those laws is going to come and arrest me, whatever, right? If I decide not to pay what's considered my fair share in that system, people with some sort of authority and weapons will come to get me. And then I wonder how does that work without talking about the morality of that, even though I just did, or at least my perception of it. With Bitcoin, it's a little bit different because right now, with the ability to enforce laws or regulations, right, with a bank, you can go to that bank and say, hey, we're the law. This person has not paid their taxes. Here's whatever legal writ that we need. And they put a lien on your account. They freeze your funds. With Bitcoin, if you're non-custodial, if you're running your own full node, you have your own wallet, and you control your own private keys, there's really nothing to stop that. That's kind of where my fiat
sure. Well, I mean,
kind of fell into it.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, tax should be a hard thing to collect. I think it shouldn't be an easy thing to collect. If you're running your own full node and you've got your own financial self-sovereignty, then great, and if you're able to kind of, I don't know, maybe earn an income which is outside of the physical society you live in, maybe you do something online and you're able to get money that way or something, and you're able to hide that money, then more power to you. But then if you want to go out and start spending that money, then you're going to get taxed. If you're going to go out and buy a car, then you get taxed. If you could buy a house, buy a big house, you get taxed. So there's still points where you can tax people. So currently, like tax systems in the US and the UK, US in particular, it's very much leans towards benefiting the richer people in society and then heavily taxing the poorer people in society. Whereas I think something like Bitcoin could make it. We can't rig the game, then, can you? You've if everyone's got that option to have their financial self-sovereignty, and if they can only extract taxed at those taxes at those points of contact, then a rich dude could hide their tax. They could, I don't know, rent a small flat or something and then pretend that they're poor and not spend any of their money. But, what's the purpose in having any of that money? That's generally not how rich people act. Rich people generally spend their money. And I think ultimately, when we say rich people, we're talking maybe the local millionaire or whatever who lives down the road from you. But the real wealth of this world is in the hands of a very, very small amount of people. And that wealth needs to be, that value needs to organically redistribute downward to people, not through force, but through preventing the monopoly they have on being able to pull the strings of government to have, the conditions where they can create all that value for themselves. So, I mean, the one statistic is that the world's bottom poorest half of the population there's 40 people on the planet who have the same amount of value as the world's poorest bottom half. So 3.7 billion. There's 40 people. Jeff Bezos is leading them there with his on his way to $1 trillion. So they're the people we need to kind of target, and then normal people then will kind of be enriched. Again, though, when I talk about time frames, we've got such huge developments in technology that. So Marx thought that from capitalism you would end up with something like socialism, and then from socialism that would evolve into communism, full-blown communism. When we've all got, when there's a robot army doing all the work for us, and we don't have to do anything at all, no one works, and we've got 3D printing self-replicas and replicators in our houses. What does that do to an economy? So, what use is money then? So, I think that my hopes that we will have productive worker co-ops. And just people, just claiming control over centralized control, decentralizing control in all forms, money, in work. When I talk about worker co-ops, all you're doing is you're taking democracy and you're just putting it into a corporation. You're getting rid of the feudalist aspect and you're putting democracy in there instead. You're democratizing the enterprise. So you just democratize everything, decentralize everything, have decision making done, in the most decentralized way in every platform. And that will then inevitably then decentralize value as well. And so that's my primary sort of interest in Bitcoin's ability to kind of make the world fair and bring up the poor people of this world.
Yeah, no,
but it may get usurped by technology. Goodness.
Hey folks, I hope that you're enjoying this episode as much as we did recording it. I don't have any sponsors, but if you could do me a big favor and go to iTunes and leave a 5-star or a written review, that would help me out a lot. You can also help out by going to supportmypodcast.com. That's supportmypodcast.com, where you can find all the other ways that you can help out. If you actually go to the discounts tab, that's supportmypodcast.com/discounts, you can get on an early mailing list, and you will get access absolutely for free as a listener and supporter of this podcast to discounts for such things as VPNs, Bitcoin wallets, Bitcoin related clothing, as well as other kind of health products that I think are very helpful for people to just live a better life. So go over to supportmypodcast.com/discounts and sign up today. Yeah, no, I mean, I think, and I can't remember the, I started to make a conscious effort to widen my circle a bit in social media and who I follow. There's a lot of like pretty good progressive people, mainly just because they've been very good on the anti-war sort of thing in the kind of the American experience, right? A lot of progressives seem to have gone full tilt in the wake of the Trump election and just basically jump in with anybody who doesn't matter, what a warmonger that they are. But anyway, so a lot of them, and so I started to get more introduced to a lot of people like Caitlin Johnstone and Asher Wolf and all that. A lot of the folks are out of Australia, I've actually found. But anyways, so I've tried to expand out a little bit, and just to get a better idea of just kind of where people's different kind of mindsets are. And I was
Yeah,
talking
no, I
with
think that's very important.
yeah, I thought that I had, whenever I hear people talk about, just make sure you don't get in the echo chambers, and I realized like, like, oh, of course, but then I realized it wasn't. And anyway, so I was talking with one of them, and one of the issues they were talking about was how big banks, and they have access, this basically they get money for free to loan out to the average people,
Mm,
and that is totally made possible by central banks. Central banks loan
mm,
them money at near or at 0%, which they can turn around and mortgage, give you a mortgage to a house, at 4%, 5%, a car loan at 12% or whatever it may be. And so the closer you are to that power, the closer you are to the creation of that fiat money, the
mm.
better off you are. And when it comes down to the average person, especially the people at the lowest rungs of the ladder, they're usually the ones facing the highest interest rates. And it's not that I don't think that Bitcoin would eliminate loans or anything like that, but I think that sort of predatory system that allows for it on such a massive scale, because I don't think that any ideology is going to eliminate the predatory nature
Well,
of man.
you can balance the books with Bitcoin, which you couldn't do. In 2008, we went to balance the books and we couldn't. There was all this fake value which had managed to get in there somehow. Whereas that's not possible with Bitcoin. You can verify the value which is there. So that kind of stops that behavior, which you were talking about there.
But yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot of, especially people who get into Bitcoin, I think that there's a lot of commonality regardless of where you come out. And kind of going back to what you said at the beginning, that what I was saying, Bitcoin very early on was libertarian, and you are correct that I kind of classify Bitcoin so far as in kind of a few waves. Like the first wave were the kind of more the more tech developer types, and then the second wave was kind of more the people that got attracted for political or activist reasons. And I think in that second wave, that was heavily libertarian. I think at least that's because that's how I found it,
Yeah, but
myself
I mean,
personally.
yeah, so you had, I mean, obviously you had the crypto anarchists, and then you had the cypherpunks, who actually kind of toned down the crypto anarchy. I mean, you just read the manifestos, read the crypto anarchy manifesto, and then read the cypherpunk manifesto. And a lot of the political stuff is kind of pulled out of the cypherpunk manifesto, and it's more about, yeah, we're going to build this software so people can just have privacy and do what you want with it.
Mm-hmm.
And then, so obviously you did have, the people like Tim May. Tim May was, I always struggle with that guy. I mean, like, so you read the Crypto Anarchy Manifesto, and obviously there's like it begins and ends with the beginning and ending from the Communist Manifesto, and you sort of, and with it being anarchism as well. I think he's in some way paying homage to the left, and there were some people within the sort of crypto anarchy movement who were kind of a bit lefty. But I think, yeah, generally it was more like US libertarian, type free market types. And then you had the cypherpunks. I mean, so like Jude Milhorn, who named the cypherpunks, she was a lefty. And then post cypherpunk, when you had Bitcoin, then like Amir Taki, for example, who wrote BIP1, and set out the bit system and organized Bitcoin so you can actually like develop it properly as free and open source software. He went off then and fought for anarcho-syndicalism in northern Syria, which is a very left concept. We fought with the Kurds against the Taliban, and to help bring about this decentralized society based on what is kind of called anarcho-syndicalism, but is they call it democratic confederalism, I think. So he was somewhat lefty, I would say. I've noticed that I've had some pretty, and I'm going to name names because I don't want to embarrass them, but I've had some pretty like well-known, influential, like leading figures, a number, more than a handful, who've come up to me and who've really wanted to kind of like discuss all this stuff, and have said that I think they look for solutions. They think, well, this kind of Austrian economics, there's not a solution there. If you've got a country in, well, I'd say the Great Depression, for example, you've got the Great Depression. So you're going to let those kids starve. You're not going to try and help them. You're not going to try and fix the problem. It's just not going to happen. People aren't going to let a government sit back and say, well, this is good for the market. This will get rid of all the bad actors so we don't have another crisis. This is not going to happen. It's just not going to happen. So yeah, I mean, so one example which I kind of wanted to bring this up before. Did I give the sort of decentralized Amazon example?
No, I don't believe you talked a little bit about the decentralization.
So here's an example. Yeah. So here's an example for you. So you have two Amazons, right? You've got a centralized Amazon. The Amazon we've got now, we've got Jeff Bezos, and then a bunch of people working there, being timed and maximum efficiency. Yeah. And then you, hypothetically now, you've got a decentralized Amazon, okay, where the people who work there receive close to the full value they put in. A percentage goes on, I don't know, bounties for software's engineers to build the piece of software which manages Amazon. Yeah? So the decision making is taken out of the hands of Jeff Bezos, and it's decentralized. It's owned by the workers. Now the products in these two Amazons are exactly the same, and they cost the same. Which Amazon are you going to choose to buy stuff from?
I would.
That's a question.
Well, yeah, sorry. No, and I'll cut this out, but I forgot to mention. I try to mute myself in between.
Oh right, shoot, sorry.
Yeah, no, it's okay. So I always try to remind people that it's not that I'm not listening. It's like I have to go and click unmute because I don't want any background.
No, it's worth it because otherwise you go yeah. I've tried to interview people in the past. It's difficult.
So no, so I would choose basically as a consumer. I mean, it would have to depend on a lot of things, So all things being equal, the way that I operate right now, for better or worse, is I choose wherever, usually whatever's easier, I guess, because and I think
so. Hypothetically, these two Amazons are exactly the same.
So apples to apples,
same products. Yep, same products, same prices, same. It looks like the same website, except one's called Amazon for decentralized Amazon, one's called Amazon, right? In the one Amazon where you pay for something, you buy something, the lorry drivers, the people in the warehouse, they're involved in the decision making of how that company is run, yeah, or how their department is run at least, and they for that they receive 99% of the value they put in. In the centralized Amazon, obviously you've got Jeff Bezos, and he's got his employees who are being employed for X amount, So you've got those two Amazons, which are structured completely differently. This is completely hypothetical, right? The products are exactly the same and the prices are exactly the same. Which one are you, when you're sat at your computer, which one are you going to go and buy from?
I mean, I guess that gets in a little bit of things like then if you're talking about is the decentralized one, is that I guess is that in a way where it was started from the ground up as like a co-op, like
It was started by like two guys got together and they created a. This is kind of I'll go through the implementation, technical implementation.
Well, I mean, no, because like the reason I ask is because I do have actually like an issue with the idea of like closed shops, with union, because I don't like the idea of forcing people into union membership and I understand that's completely different. Because
this is just say if you want to. Yeah.
But I guess just to make it simpler,
Amazon,
if I felt, without asking any more clarification questions, feeling, I would probably choose a decentralized one because I probably feel that that's just a better choice for the people that are there. I mean, it's
a better choice for the people. Yeah, for the better. It's obvious the people who work there are getting more value. They've got more autonomy. They've got democracy in the workplace. It's better. It's a better system. The other system, the centralized system with the Jeff Bezos at the top. That's feudalist in nature. It's shit. Like, sorry, I don't know if we can swear, but it's
No, it's fine. Don't worry.
It's okay to admit that. If you admit that, you're not saying I like Stalin. I like Pol Pot. He's, you're not on board with those guys. To admit that decentralized Amazon, whether or not it's possible, to admit that is a better system for the people who work there, and that as a consumer you would actively choose to go and shop there, that's okay. Like, it's, the only people who would pick the other Amazon would be people who don't like humans, who don't like other humans, or Jeff Bezos would pick the other Amazon. So, and that's what I'm saying. So when you go right back to that definition of socialism, that the means of production is controlled or regulated by the community as a whole. Sorry, a political economic theory that advocates that the means of production is owned or controlled by the community as a whole. When you go back to that original definition, that word advocates. So all I've done is I've taken the concept of, if this thing were a reality, you would support it. I've taken that and I've said, okay, well, not only will I support that, I'm going to actively pursue that. I'm going to try and make that thing possible, because I think that thing's better for people, and it's better for humanity if people go to work and they have autonomy and they receive more or less all the value which they put into the system. And I advocate that. I support that. I promote it. Yeah. Whereas yourself, you don't advocate it, you don't promote it. But if it were a reality, you would support it. So I think that this is my biggest hurdle is just helping people understand that there is a big difference between supporting that and advocating that thing, and supporting state capitalism and the gulag, and like you say, people being bullied into unions, and centralized control, and state regulation, all this stuff. Like they're separate. They're separate concepts. I disagree, and I argue a lot with like capitalist ANCAPs, Austrian economists. I disagree and argue more with a hell of a lot of socialists. They annoy the hell out of me, because so many of them, and you can honestly verify everything I've said. You can go Google it, Wikipedia it, go look at state capitalism, look at state socialism, look at socialism and how in which it differs. Look at Marx's analysis of how he arrived at socialism, through reading Adam Smith and David Ricardo, and read up on all that stuff. And then you will see that there is a big difference between giving centralized control and the control being in the hands of the producers. So its relationship to Bitcoin, for me, I find Bitcoin to be similar to that system. I prefer it to the fiat system, because I prefer to put my value and explore the technology there, because it's decentralized, and because I know by using it that I'm not aiding and abetting corruption and centralization of wealth. So does that kind of make sense? I had a little bit of rant at the end.
Yeah, but I mean, I would push back just like a little bit when you're talking about just the idea that Amazon itself is implicitly, immoral in a way as a feudalist, concept. Is that Amazon, I would say, is more empowering than what we had 50 years ago, to me, because being someone who is, and maybe just because my own experience has clouded my outlook, but being someone who's done a lot of like side hustle stuff on the internet, buying and reselling things, going to garage sales and flipping stuff, is that websites like Amazon's, Amazon, eBay, those ones, their capital investment is offered at now a platform where I can, 50, 100 years ago, my ability to sell would be to, where I grew up as a child was in a town of like 200 people in the mountains in Alaska. My ability to sell those items would be severely limited. Now I can sell, an ebook. I can sell, a podcast.
Is that not just the internet?
Yeah, no,
And
it's the internet, but it's also,
yeah.
I mean, like we had message boards, and I remember, you could start a GeoCities website for free and all that, in the '90s, and do that. But the idea of e-commerce, a lot of it's open source, and I am an advocate 100% for the concept of open source over something like proprietary or patent. I do not believe in IP at all. I think once you have an idea and you you broadcast that idea to the world, I don't think that you have any right to restrict another person from using it. But that's a different discussion. But I do feel that the massive capital investment to bring something like YouTube to the world originally, now over time, on a long enough timeline, you see, oh well, we don't need a centralized system like YouTube because we have X now that can do that for us, or whatever. But I mean, just kind of looking in the micro of what they were able to do that didn't exist before.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I agree completely. So did Marx. Marx agreed completely. If you read the beginning of the Communist Manifesto, he explicitly sings the praises of capitalism's ability to find utility and create value, and to evolve industry, which is why he said that it would be a fully evolved capitalist state, which would then flip to socialism. So all that stuff, all that utility finding. So it's not so often when people think of capitalism, they think, well, that's where the innovation happens, and some innovation happens within capitalism. Most of it happens in university laboratories, and is gifted to the free market, and then the free market expands and finds utility within it. Look at everything which makes up your iPhone look at the internet, for example, or public key cryptography. These things are developed by intellectuals and technicians and engineers who have the thinking space to be able to sit down and create something, and often that is in places like a university or some sort of government-funded research center, or it could be like with Tesla, for example. Most of their R&D is paid for by government subsidy to create new industry. Capitalism is fantastic at finding utility and developing stuff, but it has those inherent contradictions. So look at Bitcoin exchanges, for example. You have these Bitcoin exchanges, great, they work, you can use them, and then there's too much messing around, and they screw people over, and then something like Bisca turns up, where it's a decentralized platform where you no longer have the capitalist who owns it. It's owned and regulated by the people who use the software and who want to change the software. And similarly with Amazon, there's only so far they can push those people before people will come up with a decentralized way of doing an Amazon. And to be honest, like, just given time, somebody will create that anyway, and then use a lot of the sort of technology which was founded and the utility finding by Amazon. They'll use that to then inform their development of their open source, decentralized version of Amazon. And there was Open Bazaar for a while, which seemed very promising, and lots of Bitcoiners backed that. They backed Open Bazaar, and Open Bazaar was going towards a more decentralized version of Amazon. I want that. I want the decentralized Amazon. I don't want it through force. I want it through a free market. I want that to. So we have co-ops. We have some big co-ops too in the world, but they can't compete with feudalism. They can't compete with one dude saying, do this, and then his managers and then going off and following his instructions, and then his workers and the workers of the managers then following those instructions. You can't compete with it. But if we have like a way of making decisions collectively in a decentralized system through consensus, which I think is possible through public key cryptography, multi-sig wallets, some sort of federated sidechain, hackery strapped onto and pegged to Bitcoin. To be honest, it's almost so when we're talking about before about the original politics of Bitcoin, this is the commodity finding. See, this is the it's like a byproduct of the computer science problems which make Bitcoin possible. So we want to have a censorship-resistant form of money without a trusted third party. Well, in order to do that, we need to be able to have a piece of free and open source. It needs to be free and open source software. Well, in order to say what's going to happen to that free and open source software, we need to be able to, come to consensus over decision making, which we do through the node software we're running. So we then so even if you're diehard Rothbard Austrian economics guy running your own full node at home, then you're contributing towards experimenting on decision making in a decentralized system, which words like decentralization and consensus have been battered around in socialism for 150 years. It's something we've been discussing about for a very long time. So even if it's sort of an accidental property of the Bitcoin protocol, it enables this thing which is better. That decentralized Amazon is better. It enables us working towards that better system. And then hopefully, with those decentralized organizations and systems over those centralized ones, we all know that decentralized things are generally more stable. So hopefully then it will become, it will create a more stable world in time.
Yeah, I guess, I kind of mentioned a little bit earlier my main reason for coming to the concept of libertarianism, or at least the American version of it, was this idea of kind of the rejection of coercion. And one of the questions I guess I've always had for someone, whether they're a socialist or anarcho-communist or a full communist, it just kind of but somewhere within that spectrum is why within, I guess there are different versions of libertarianism, just like there's different flavors of socialism as well. And depends on who you ask, but kind of a pretty wide brushstroke of libertarianism has this concept of the idea that people can kind of go and do whatever they want, right? So the broad concept of libertarianism is without a rejection of the idea of the initiation of violence, where if a group of socialists or people of wide enough tent that you wanted to get together on the left that broadly agreed on roughly the same concepts, wanted to pool enough capital within the capitalist structure to say go and buy a large quantity of land. I mean, we're not talking about right now. The idea of doing that and seceding is completely improbable. But kind of in the idea of a libertarian world, that's possible. It can go and you can do that. You can have the producer ownership of the means of production, while 10 miles away you have anarcho-communists or anarcho-capitalists with their salt mines and privately owned nuclear weapons. Which is kind of the caricature, but
do no harm.
Yeah, right. So yeah, no, it's just I always one of the things I've always enjoyed about libertarians, at least the embracement of the caricature. But anyway, I mean, like,
it's the gun ownership is interesting. Yeah, sorry, Karen. I usually say chlorine gas. I say, well, can you not have chlorine gas? That's not fair. You should be allowed chlorine gas.
Well, as long as it doesn't, if any of that waves inch onto my own private property, then I have recourse to use a similar violence upon you, right? But anyways, I digress. This kind of is digressing more into the political side versus just the Bitcoin, but it was just something I wanted to ask you.
It's impossible not to, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, especially within this topic, and especially when socialism itself is kind of one of the main overarching. But is that not, like, I've always wondered why can't we kind of form a broad coalition with people on the left of going, like, embracing the concept of libertarianism in terms of people being able to go and do what they want, as long as they aren't trying to force anybody else, saying, well, you're right on my border, but we want to be able to make you do what we want. If you just kind of live within your own borders, or if you want to buy up. And then to me, that system itself, while it seems on the face of it, utopian. It's not going to work perfectly. There's always going to be issues because people are people in any system. But that for the most part, it would seem to me that that would then be a true marketplace of ideas in a way of going like, well, look at those people over there. They're not being interfered with by, by capitalist, embargoes from the outside or whatever, anything like that. They're doing their thing while we're doing our thing. And whoever can kind of make the greater case through actual action and results, I would imagine would work better. I mean, what are your thoughts kind of on that kind of broad thought experiment?
Yeah, no, I agree. Yeah, I agree absolutely completely. I want that revolution. I don't want it to be. I don't want it to be. So, yeah, a lot of it's kind of I want that revolution to be peaceful and to happen within in a free market scenario. I want that decentralized Amazon to, because it's more efficient. I mean, you've worked for people, work for people. I've worked for people, work for people. Generally, people on the front line in a department are very well informed on how best to take that department forward, or on the decisions, on the most efficient decisions. Like, when you work for someone else, they'll often give you lots of tasks which are kind of crap and will justify the existence of the people above you. That doesn't happen if the people who are working in the department are the ones who are collectively making those decisions. So it happens less. They're more efficient. So currently, the only reason which stops like a co-op from smashing like a centralized organization out of the water is it's just really hard to organize, and like organize ownership, like part ownership, and making these decisions. But once you overcome that, because that's a technological thing, really. Once you overcome that technological problem through this crazy new invention, which to me is kind of like the printing press, which brought democracy to the world. The Bitcoin and these decentralized systems could bring democracy into the workplace. So yeah, I mean, I want that to happen in a peaceful free market scenario, and I think it would outcompete, just like free and open source software's outcompeting proprietary software. It may not look like it's outcompeting it, but it really is. So 95% of maybe more, maybe it's like 98% of the internet is on Linux servers. Most people, I imagine Androids are the predominant phone on the planet now. So more and more people are using Linux on their desktops and using free and open source software. And so I want it to happen kind of like the software revolution. I want it to happen. This plucky upstart, which is made possible by this new technology, then quite quickly snowballs into kind of a new way of doing things, which is better off for everyone. You can't argue that free open source software isn't better ultimately for the freedom of the users and the autonomy of the users. It's interesting you say that, because I recently went to Copenhagen. So obviously you think of Denmark as being quite socialist, but obviously it's kind of like a state socialist. But they're kind of just there's a socialist vibe there. The people there are quite socialisty. And in the middle of Copenhagen, there's a town called Christiania, and you can go there, and it's pretty lawless. You can pretty much do what you want. You can go and smoke weed there, whatever, take drugs. They have prostitution. It's pretty lawless. It's a little bit like walking in because Denmark's quite progressive, and everyone looks really nice, and everything's really nice and pretty, and the food's really good, and it's quite arty and cool. And then you kind of go from that, and you walk into this environment which is artistic and like pushing like a high form of freedom, but it feels a bit Walking Dead. It feels a bit. It's not the sort of place you'd want to bring up your kids. Was it Rose? Yeah. So there's a socialist called Rosa Luxemburg, who again was an anti-statist. She's very good if anyone's interested in this sort of anti-state idea of socialism. Rosa Luxemburg's a very good person to look up. She was killed for a sort of anti-state sentimentalities. So she's a really good socialist to look up. But Rosa Luxemburg, she's the one who said that socialism or barbarism. So yeah, I mean, it's libertarians, if they want to have, nuclear weapons and not pay for roads and whatever, or, sue each other through private courts, I think, there are places in this world you can experience that level of freedom, and they're generally the third world, because they're not great places. You can have complete free markets, and you don't have to pay for roads, you don't have to pay taxes, and they're not great places to live. So I personally would want to live in a society which is stable, and stability comes from good infrastructure, and good infrastructure currently comes from kind of taxes, until we can kind of work out maybe a better way of doing it. Maybe taxes are a really goofy, buggy way of doing it, but currently that's kind of where it comes from. And I understand there is that idea that taxes is enforced, because if you don't pay it, then you get arrested and you get chucked in jail. But maybe people should have that option to then move somewhere where they don't have to pay taxes and don't have to pay for that infrastructure, and then good luck to them. I hope it works out for them, but I'm not sure it will.
No, and you talk about as well, like you don't want a bloody revolution or anything like that, and it kind of reminds me of a quote by Murad Mammadov, who's a Bitcoin maximalist, and he had said before that the difference between like gold and Bitcoin was that for the most part, gold bugs, this is more definitely gold bugs were definitely more in the libertarian camp, at least in the United States. There weren't a lot of people on the left who at all cared about returning to a gold standard per se. Definitely not. It was not a common thread. Whereas in libertarianism, although libertarianism is so small, you kind of know everybody who's anybody there pretty quickly. But with gold, a lot of it was like, okay, make sure you buy gold. This fiat system is going to crash. And once it all burns to the ground, you'll have your gold and you'll kind of become a large stakeholder in the new system, because, once everybody realizes we need to go back to gold, your gold's going to be worth a lot more than it was, when you're buying it with the fiat dollars and blah, blah, blah. Where, his point was that gold kind of required to ever kind of come into fruition is that it was going to require almost the current system to burn down. Whereas Bitcoin can kind of slowly replace the system, or maybe not, slowly per se. I guess it's kind of a subjective term, but can just pull energy, pull attention, and pull value out of the fiat system into itself over time as it just replaces it. And I think that was, another reason that that I'm a huge, kind of fell in love with Bitcoin, was that it's not saying, we need to, overthrow the, with fire and blood, the old system. It's like, this thing is just better. People are going to naturally, over time, as we prove that it's better, going to decide to choose to go with what is inherently a more moral and a more fair system than what exists currently.
Let's hope so, man. Let's hope we don't have horrible economic crisis and then a sudden rush. I honestly, that's my ultimate hope, is that it's slow and value trickles into Bitcoin, and then similarly, the workplace is reformed to have those democratic qualities which socialism wants, and then it's a slow revolution. But I mean, like you say, subjective. It's so dependent upon whether we can just keep the world stable for a little bit longer.
But we've been going for a while. I know it's very late in the UK where you're at. I wanted to say thank you, but why don't you tell all the listeners where they can find you, if there's whether it's Twitter or any of the other projects that you're working on, your YouTube. Just to let everybody know where they can find you and how they can get a hold of you.
Yeah, so I mean, if you want to chat to me, you could go on Twitter and at BTC Socialist, one word. Or if I've also made a series of videos on IoT devices, so sort of retrofitting devices to kind of accept Bitcoin, and that's on the World Crypto Network. I also just expand that out to kind of looking at using hardware like microcontrollers and little screens and keypads and so on. They've come down so much in price now that these sort of devices are incredibly cheap. So I've made a bunch of tutorials on experimenting with those devices, experimenting with those microcontrollers, and just I build a sweep machine and get that to accept Bitcoin over Lightning, and then I had a keypad, and then that module which I made for the sweep machine is then a point of sale terminal, and it costs like $15. So it's cheap enough to make and give to your local coffee shop. It uses the service OpenNode. A lot of my projects use the service OpenNode, which I think is really good. That's a private company, but they're a really good private company, so I like them. I'm also so I sort of bring out tutorials quite regularly. My interest is actually it's an Andreas quote, which really struck a chord. He was in an interview and they were talking about IoT. And he was saying about the two scenarios. You've got one scenario where IoT ends up being sort of corporate owned, and you have these listening devices in your house, and they're collecting all this data on you. Or you've got we can use this thing to liberate ourselves. You've got the IoT devices which are owned and regulated by the people, the people who actually own them, and they have control and they understand how it works. And that's the sort of IoT type stuff I'm trying to work on, is being able to use cheap, accessible, verifiable technology, which people can easily build their own projects with. And it's been cool. I've had a bunch of people take, so say my sweep machine, for example, a guy, he made a pinball machine using the same module. So it's great to kind of see like people feeding back and then show me the projects which they've made as well. So if you want to watch my tutorials, they're on the World Crypto Network on YouTube. If you don't know that network, if you don't know that channel, they've been around in Bitcoin, since like 2013, I think. And they've always been great. They've always had great content. Definitely subscribe to it. If you go on the World Crypto Network and you go to playlists, I've got a playlists and it's got all my tutorials in. You can buy the components. It'll cost you like $20, and there's like close to like, I think it's like 12 different tutorials you can do with those same components. So yeah, that's pretty much it. So Twitter or YouTube, that's it.
Well, once again, I'd like to thank you. I'll have all the show notes, everything that we mentioned, as well as all the contact information on the show notes at didyouknowcrypto.com/EP35. That's EP35 for episode 35. And once again, Ben, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, man. I'm sorry if I rambled somewhat. It's very late and I'm a bit hazy.
No, I totally have a penchant for that myself. So I do that on occasion, and one of my favorite phrases is "I digress." So, but no, that you're in good company.
I digress.
So
there we go. Brilliant. Cheers. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for listening to the episode. I hope you guys enjoyed it as much as I did. Ben is a really cool guy. Like I said at the beginning, we don't always agree, and you heard that in the episode. But, we're two people that both love Bitcoin, talking about why it's important to us and why it's important to humanity as a whole. If you could do one quick thing for me, go over to iTunes and leave a 5-star and a written review. You could also go over to supportmypodcast.com/discounts. That's supportmypodcast.com/discounts, and sign up to be on the mailing list to get in for an absolutely free program that will give you discounts on things such as KeepKey and Tracer hardware wallets, Bitcoin merchandise, clothing, hats, all that kind of good stuff, as well as Bitcoin artwork, as well as health-related items that I use, such as Four Sigmatic mushroom coffee, which is really, really cool stuff. Mushrooms are highly undervalued for people's health. But anyways, and the very last thing is, please help support the Bitcoin for ALS campaign. Go to bitcoinforals.com, sign up to be on the mailing list to find out when we go live, or just follow us on Twitter, Bitcoin 4ALS, at Bitcoin 4ALS. and we're going to be supporting them in what they do, and they are currently running some free giveaways and things like that. So I really appreciate your guys' time, and thanks for listening.